you all to our HR series, and today we'll be talking about coaching for high-impact leadership in China. Cindy Jensen will be taking our webinar today, but before we start the webinar, I'd like to do some testing. I understand that some of you may have already heard some of us doing our practice earlier, so you may have already heard us, but just wanted to check on everybody that they understand how to use the system. So please, if you can hear me, can you please raise your hand? You'll see in your panel a hand. If you can click that hand, please raise it. Great, I can see lots of people raising their hands. That means they can hear us loud and clear. Is that enough? Okay. Also, in the panel, there is a section where you can ask questions. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and we'll try to incorporate them throughout Cindy's presentation, or we'll come to them at the end of the presentation. So thank you very much. Okay. So just to start with, I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about what the EU SME Centre does. So the SME Centre is a project funded by the European Union, and it's to support EU SMEs to develop and build commercial activities in China. And right now, it's absolutely free. It's confidential, and we provide many, many services, including you can ask a question through our inquiry system online. You can download publications. There's many training throughout Europe and in China that you can attend on many subjects, including HR, standards, legal, and business development generally. And this webinar is part of the series that we offer. We have a selection of databases that you can go to find out if you have a need for a service provider, or you want to see if the law has been updated. There's databases. And also, and also we have the support services such as the hot desk. So the hot desk is if you're in China, you need somewhere to stay, to use the desk facilities and office facilities, you're more than welcome to come to the Beijing office and use the hot desk. And we can provide briefings on services, on industries at the office, and some matchmaking and networking opportunities. That's a little bit about the centre. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about Cindy. Cindy Jensen is the EU SME Centre's expert for human resource management and training at the centre. She's an experienced global consultant with more than 10 years' experience in leadership roles. And she worked at Frito-Lay, part of the PepsiCo group, the food group, and Telsus Mobility in Canada. She's been in China for 12 years, developing leadership programs in a wide range of industries, including IT, pharma, banking, food and beverages, and also in mining. She's a credentialed coach with the ICF, and she's also registered as an ICF mentor coach as part of the International ICF Reciprocal Peer Coaching Program. So before we start with Cindy, I'm going to pass you over to Cindy, sorry.
Thank you, Jess Paul. It's great to be here and to joining everyone. And I did pick up there may be some audio quality issues, so just send us a quick message. I just want to cover off some of the topics today. So in terms of coaching, what we will be looking at will be some of the current research pertaining to coaching. And what we're going to do is we'll put it in the context of China. I'll also be sharing with you just some of the not only research and work that I've been doing in China around leadership development and executive coaching, and also tying into some of the generational differences research that I've been involved in. Many times people will ask, they'll say, what are the common themes around coaching? Why are people retaining executive coaching? And in my experience, a couple of common themes, and this is in particular around executive coaching as opposed to lifestyle coaching. Many times people are looking for guidance around leadership development. So, for example, if somebody has taken on a new role or expanded responsibility, oftentimes you'll find for high potential or leaders who are taking on a more expanded role. In China, probably another common theme is around cross-cultural effectiveness. And that's two areas where expatriates are coming into China and who are leading a diverse team. And many times it's not just Chinese team, but maybe from other countries. What we're also finding with the Chinese leaders is for many companies, global positions are being held here in China. So, for example, that leader could be dealing with Europe in the afternoon, the U.S. in the morning or in the evening, which adds another complexity to their role. So the second part of our discussion today will really be looking at, for many of the leaders, if they say, all right, I'd like to impart more of a coaching leadership style, how would I begin to do that? So it's giving guidance and tools around being an effective leader and coach.
So thank you very much, Cindy. So before we start into the whole presentation, we just want to get an understanding of what people think executive coaching actually is. So I'm going to launch our first poll today. Here we go. So the question is, what is executive coaching? Offering guidance from one's own experience, assessing an organization practice and recommending solutions, partnering in a thought-provoking and creative process to maximize personal and professional potential, working towards achievement of specific learning objectives, or improving emotional well-being. So I can see the answers all coming in. Oh, very interesting. Okay. And shall we close it? Should we wait a little bit longer?
Well, a few people are still voting. It's interesting. We're seeing a trend here for sure. And there is a favored answer.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're ready to close. And I'm now going to share the results with everybody so we can see. So, according to the results, Cindy, we've got 6% say offering guidance from one's own experience. The biggest one is the partnering in thought-provoking and creative process to maximise personal and professional potential. What do you think this actually says?
Yeah, so I think that's great. It sounds like a lot of the listeners today that are either coaches or taking on a coaching role within their organization. So actually this question parallels one of the recent research that has just come out, and I want to share that with you. The ICF, they did a global research, or they did a global consumer awareness study, and they asked that very same question. So our listeners today have a much better understanding than the global survey. 10,000 people were surveyed, and 35% of them indicated that coaching was in fact partnering in a thought-provoking and creating process, which is it, exactly it. And you could see almost a third really felt it was offering guidance from one's own experience. So we can see definitely that's taking on much more of a mentorship role. And then less so as we move down, assessing organizational practices and recommending solutions, more of a consulting. Yeah. So the awareness of coaching, what we're finding in this global study is it's increasing. People still have different and varied ideas of what, in fact, executive coaching is. Many times coaching, it's often confused with being a teacher, consultant, or advisor. I remember 10 years ago when I first started coaching in China, I would often be referred to as a teacher, or they wanted my expert advice or what my opinion is. So the idea of coaching is really not designed to be a role of any one of those. In fact, if you find that you are working with your employees and you want to take on a coaching role and you find that you are advising or solving problems for the employee, you're in fact taking on one of these other roles.
So you don't have to be an expert in that industry to coach somebody?
No, and that's a really good question, because many times what you'll find is executive coaches in fact don't even have that industry experience. And we'll talk in a few minutes about, in fact, what is the role of the coach. But for those of those who are tuning in that are less familiar with the role of coaching, I'm just sharing with you what the ICF definition is. So coaching is really a partnering with individuals, and this is in a thought-provoking and creative process. So, and really it's around building personal or professional potential. So coaching, very much, it's a dialogue or conversation, and it's through questioning or inquiring. And you can probably think of a time when you were working with a manager, and your manager asked you questions in such a way that enables you to solve a problem or an issue. And that's really the essence of coaching.
I remember I had a manager who was quite busy, but he recommended that I see a coach to help me with some things. And it was very, very useful, because they didn't tell me what to do, but they helped me work it out by asking the right questions.
And what we'll see in a few minutes is this is definitely a leadership trend when leaders look at their own professional development, is how can I be a more effective leader? And I'll share why that's important in terms of the context of China. So for an employee, that can be, as you described, it can be very empowering when you, it creates more of a learning environment for the employee. So when we differentiate coaching, I mean, really what it is, it's an enabler. You're trying to create a sense of discovery for, and I'm going to use, instead of coaching, I'm going to use the word of employee. So I'll use manager-employee, manager being the coach in the context of our webinar today, and I'll use the word employee when I refer to a coachee. So with the coach, it's really about enabling an employee to find the possibility and the potential in uncovering whether it's an issue or problem that they're currently faced with. What it is not, it's not about telling. And I think as managers, traditionally many of us are very good at teaching or perhaps telling or guiding or advising. One thing that coaching definitely is not about managing performance. So that's something that you want to deal with differently. It's not about, you can come up with solutions from a coaching way, but it's not for typically managing poor performance. I just want to delve into a bit more on some further coaching research. And the global awareness, because you were asking the other day, what was the awareness of coaching by age group?
Yes.
And what we're finding is that when you look at the ages 25 to 34, I'm just checking to see if we're having any sound problems. Any sound issues? Okay. I noticed an email had come in that there was some sound. So just send us an email if there's some sound issues. So the awareness of coaching by age group, we're finding that over 2/3 of within the ages of 25 to 34 were very aware or somewhat aware of coaching. And this is globally, about 18,000 people responded. And it's important to look at, this is a consumer awareness, so it's not just, in the corporate environment this survey was conducted. The least aware would be age 55. So it's pretty common in terms of the awareness. And what we're noticing, this study has been conducted over 4 years. That awareness, coaching is something as a practice, professionals or even non-professionals are becoming much more aware of. Also, I just wanted to share who was involved in this study. So depending on where you're sitting, calling in from today, China is a new addition to the study, to the 2014 study. You can see all of the European countries and a few countries that actually had opted out of this study. So this is the ICF Global Consumer Awareness. So the next thing is there was another study. This was done by Stanford. And what I want to take a look at for a few minutes before we look at coaching with employees is some of the research that came out around leaders. So this is CEOs who were surveyed regardless of size of organization. So what we found in this study, so this was with Stanford School of Business and the Miles Group, which is a consulting group. And in this survey found that almost every CEO surveyed actually enjoyed the process of receiving coaching and leadership advice. So this was really important to them. There's a real appetite for executive coaching. And, you know, and it's anecdotally we know this because what we're finding is when you get at that level, where do you learn and how do you learn? The opportunities for learning. And very rarely can somebody actually pull themselves away from the business to, you know, attend a program or a training. So it's an important part for professional development.
And managers don't have, their managers don't have time because their results are results driven. And so they ask them to do coaching elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So let's take a look at the areas of interest for these CEOs. So what we found here is the study further asked what skills or behaviors are they working on. So sharing leadership or delegating skills was an important areas that leaders were working on. So you can see the numbers here, 37%. The study also further looked at when you ask CEOs how important was this skill for you to be developing, you can see it was about, again, pretty well mirrored, 35%. The directors refer to the directors within that organization. So you can see there's a bit of a difference there, but not much. So it's some interesting findings. The next one, conflict management skills, was a very important behavior skill for CEOs to be working on. CEOs found this as being one of the top areas where they wanted to develop. And what we find is that most often in the CEO role, if something comes to your desk, it's only because if a problem or a decision comes to your desk is because, you know, people are just having an issue resolving it. That's right, So it's either because you're not able to get consensus around it or, you know, leaders within the organization aren't sure how to work through it. So these conflict management skills become very important at that level. Then just to highlight some of the other skills, I think it's important, if we look at the third and fourth skills, you can see communication and listening, which is a part of communication. This is something that leaders said, I really need to improve in this area. I need to be listening, I need to be understanding and communicating effectively. This research ties in quite nicely to what we're seeing in China.
Interesting.
So now let's specifically, because we've looked at some global research, now let's specifically hone into China. And if you were listening a couple of weeks ago, I shared this research, but I'd like to share it again. And this is the MRIC talent report, so why talent stay in a job. So there's a couple of key things here that we're finding. We're finding that the opportunity to increase responsibility. So employees are saying, I need to be motivated by a challenge and I will stay with that company. The second one, work-life balance. This one is important as we look at sort of gender. So the important data for mainland China is what we're finding is that more women professionals were prepared to trade money for work-life balance.
That's interesting.
So that's something that's becoming very important as we look at sort of keeping and retaining talent in China. And then we're also going to look in a few minutes about, you know, the strategic leadership and strategic direction was important. And this ties in as well to what employees also are saying about my boss, who my boss is or my immediate reporting line. And in a few minutes we'll talk about how that is important and why that's important for employees. The Towers-Watson also, they said, well, what does it take around keeping employees engaged? That's a study they did last year. And interesting, it's really consistent, some of the themes that we are seeing. So employees, what they're saying is, I want to be informed in how the business is doing. I'm taking an interest. Are we achieving our goals? Are we meeting our performance? And they also want to understand, are the values, what values are important to organizations? Secondly, employees are also voicing the importance of having a boss that's taking on more of a coaching role rather than managing. And so when we think of managing, that's more of the directing style. And in some cases, if we look at in the China context, we're seeing a move away from the traditional sort of more autocratic role of management. We're seeing this as well, that manager's role is very much shifting from a technical expert. So this is China context to very much of a people manager.
This happens in a lot of countries though, doesn't it, where technical experts are promoted to people managers, and actually they need the coaching to be able to be a people manager, because technical managers and a people manager not necessarily the same skills.
Absolutely. I mean, we see that definitely in engineering areas, research, and the more technical areas. But also in the context of this research, what it is referring to is that many times a manager is a subject matter expert. You know, they've been promoted because of their ability to drive results, because they have expertise in an area. And that is becoming less important. It's more important for really building and developing a team. Okay. So the next question, we've actually had a number of small businesses say, all right, you know, what is the most effective way to be managing and leading people? And this ties into sort of how to create a coaching environment. So
I just want to go into the next poll at this stage. So the question is, and let me launch it so you can all see the poll. Let's have a look. How do I get this poll up? Sorry, everybody. Here you go. What is my key reason for coaching? That's the next poll question. For not coaching. Okay, so the first answer is I'm unsure of how to have how to coach, how to have a coaching conversation. It's easier to tell someone what to do. I do not see it as my role, or time is an issue and it prevents me from coaching. So I just wanted to see what the poll says on this.
So this is
interesting. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, we're almost seeing an even split.
Yeah. And I'm unsure. I mean, obviously, this is one of the reasons why people have joined us today, because they want to learn a little bit more about coaching. The answers are still coming in. I think we're probably ready now. I'll share with everybody. Okay.
Yeah, so a third of the group is saying I'm unsure of how to have a coaching conversation, which we'll talk about. And most common, for those of you that said time is an issue and prevents me from coaching, that is probably the most common reason. And it's not even coaching. We often hear managers saying, I don't have, you know, it's hard for me to have time to sit down and, you know, give feedback to my employees because, you know, we're busy, everyone's busy.
Yes, exactly. We'll have some questions here. I'm wondering if I should ask that question now. One moment. I'm just going to put us back to the presentation. So Arthur is asking, I'm going to ask Arthur's question here. Can I expect very different conflicts in China than I have in Europe?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think to answer that, I think what we'll find is it depends on what the issues are of conflict. So if I put it in the context of coaching teams of all different levels within the organization and different types of organization, it's really hard to come up with a clear definition of conflict. If you're sitting here in China, and I don't like to use the word conflict, but it's understanding how to navigate cultural differences. In particular, if you are a foreign business setting up a business or currently conducting business in China. And I think, and that comes from both sides. That comes from both sort of foreign companies and expatriates working in Chinese, but there's the same level of earnestness from Chinese that want to be able to work effectively with their foreign counterparts. I mentioned earlier as we started the webinar that a lot of companies in China will have global positions in China, so Chinese leaders that are taking on a global role, in particular in the IT sector. And so what that means is they will be dealing with multiple countries at a given time. Yeah, yeah. So I would say that the context of that that's what you would probably notice in China. Okay. So I think, now let's take it in the context of managers and leaders saying, all right, I'd like to be coaching more with my team members. And what is a coachable moment? I think the important thing is first of all, what you need is there has to be an opportunity, a willingness from the coachee. So, and even if you're looking at a coaching relationship, if I were to go in and work with an organization, you often call it, the chemistry meeting. So, but in the organizational context within your company, the question you want to be asking yourself, is the employee receptive? Is he or she open to having that type of conversation? Also, what's defined by a coachable moment if there's a learning opportunity. So you see an opportunity to sit down with an employee and have a conversation that's going to help them learn. And really it's giving them an opportunity to leverage. And it's not about, and let me actually just share a little bit about the climate for coaching. So when you look at this, it's about credibility. So it's about trust. So is there the level of trust within that relationship or within that conversation? And first of all, there has to be credibility. So credibility, they see you having credibility. And there's a good relationship. So for example, if you were my employee and I was defining a coaching moment, you would see we'd have a good relationship. There'd be credibility, we respect each other. The self-orientation, and really what that means is it's not, in a coaching moment, it's not about you and the manager. It's not about you trying to drive results or look for an answer. It's really about focusing on the employee. So you'll notice that there's going to be a real imbalance if a manager or leader is going in there with the wrong reasons. For example, if you have a set agenda. So, so that's really important in sort of creating the climate for coaching. So a couple of things, what defines sort of the mindset as a manager. This takes time. It's a process that's going to take time. So if you're creating an environment where you want to work with an employee to help them sort of solve an issue or come up with different options around a problem, you're not always going to get the right answer the first try. And it may not happen even within that conversation. That particular conversation was about taking, really taking the time. You don't want to be feeling rushed as you go into this conversation. And it's really important about the manager and the learner or the employee. It's about really supporting one another in dialogue and having a dialogue, a true dialogue and conversation. And when I say preparation is assumed on both part of the conversation, it means I'm prepared to consider maybe option and ideas that you may have as an employee or somebody that I'm, going into a coaching conversation. But the other thing, too, is it's about really being open to having your point of view changed or maybe even altered. Okay.
So when you say preparation, it doesn't mean that you need to prepare what the outcome is. It's being prepared to have the conversation because sometimes you don't know what the answer is. So
I think that's a very good point that you raised. And, as you talk about that coaching mindset there isn't a prepared outcome. You're absolutely right. It's about creating a dialogue around the possibilities of solutions. And it's also, as the manager or leader, being prepared and acknowledging that you, in fact, may not have the best answer.
Yeah. And does it matter, do you need to use a different style for different levels of seniority when you're coaching?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute. And I think the style of coaching isn't really determined by, the seniority that somebody is or even where they're from, it's really about that style of the individual. Okay. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes as we look at, I'm going to show you some research around generational differences. Okay. Okay, so establishing trust. So, what does that mean sort of in the coaching environment or when you're having that conversation with the employee? So we've already touched on some of this. So the coach, you're not required to have the answer as the coach or the manager. In fact, if you try and navigate the conversation around an answer that you have implanted in your mind, that employee will pick up on that. That's probably a good recipe for coaching failure if the employee can sense that you have sort of an agenda. It's about safe space for learning. So what that means is the ability, there will be mistakes made along the way. So what I mean by that is I may not actually have the best answer. Yes. I may actually make a few mistakes. So I think that is important. Okay, I'm just pausing here because we're getting an indication that the sound is poor, and I don't know, our weather isn't the best today. Can just show of hands if you can show us how the sound reception is. We just want to do a quick check on the audio. Okay, thank you very much. So it might be just a few locations. Thank you.
Just while we're pausing, I just want to remind everybody to please keep sending their questions in, and I'll try to interject in Cindy's presentation, or even at the end we can ask some more questions. So just a reminder to please keep asking questions.
And then I think the final point around trust is, as a coach, you have to be confident that you don't have the process, there aren't any predetermined expectations, which we've talked about. Okay, so coaching presence, and I think what we really mean about that is as a coach or manager, when you're moving into this coaching conversation, it's about being very present. And what that means is not being distracted. You want to be in a quiet, private environment if you can, so your cell phone is off. You're not, you've made it clear to sort of people around you that you're having time with this employee, and you're not going to be interrupted. Coaching presence is also, when I say sense of inquiry, is really about not only asking questions, and we'll talk about powerful questions in a few minutes, but a sense of inquiry is really being interested in the employee's or the coachee's point of view. So formulating questions that will help the coachee or employee in this case really begin to consider sort of alternatives, different points of view. It's really about, maybe, I like using the analogy of peeling the onion, or having a different lens of looking at things. Attentive listening is about truly being present and listen. And I can think of occasions where I have had a conversation with somebody, and it felt for me that they were being so present and so attentive. I felt, and it really has an incredible impact on a conversation and dialogue.
I think you made a really good point. Earlier, is that I think people and employees know when you've got an agenda, know when you're not listening, and it comes across as quite fake. So this is like the presence is really important.
Yeah. And, we see this today even as, as we communicate. I mean, many times people will refer, if you're out in a restaurant, you say, look at all the people that are out for dinner with each other, and they're all on their cell phones or sending messages. But it's, it's not being distracted by your phone and your text messages and computers. But the other thing too is as a coach, you can offer an objective perspective as well. It's not about necessarily agreeing. It's about maybe sort of challenging in an encouraging way, offering a different perspective, and also perhaps seeing, sharing how you see things, providing again that it's objective. Okay, so when we talk to when we talk about powerful questioning, it's really important that questions are leading. And that they're open-ended questions, because with a closed question, yes or no, or a direct question, what happens is it just ends the conversation. It's like, so do you think that was a good idea, Jazz Pal? And you're like, all of a sudden your mind's going, no, maybe it wasn't such a great idea. Or why do you think that was a good idea? And the questions aren't being tailored for a specific answer, because, based on, as a manager, many times we have great experience, whether it's, years of experience and knowledge that we can draw from. You don't want to be asking questions like, I know what the answer is and I'm going to navigate the question so I get that answer. And many times it's about seeking to clarify or confirm. And it's not so much even for the manager or the coach, but it's also for the coachee. By asking, for clarification or confirmation around, what you are describing to me or explaining, sometimes will bring clarity to you. Yes. So, seeking questions that help clarify can help offer perspective. And we talked earlier about questions, can be challenging in a positive way. Right. And I think it's also that questions are designed to help self-discover. So working with you as the employee, are you able to see things from a different perspective or a different lens that we've talked about? So coaching is also it's about also having the coachee or the employee commit to some actions and goal setting. So it's not just, sometimes people feel, oh, well, it's just a nice friendly conversation, which it's not. Yeah. It's very goal-driven and action-oriented for the coachee. But equally as important, it's about who is coming up with the action plan. So generally, you'll start with a coaching conversation about setting some objectives, what the employee would hope to achieve at the end of the conversation. So similarly, how do the action plans tie into some of those objectives? Again, as a coach, you want to have your employee formulate those action plans. Because we deliver best on things that we've owned and have determined. And it's not to say that you can't offer perspective, but it's, it's a partnership on setting up goals for the employee. This also enhances learning when you come up with some actions, or she or he comes up with actions. Go ahead, Jessica.
I just wanted to ask, so when you go into a coaching with a coachee, should they have a number of questions that they want to go through? I mean, could you just start a coaching session without any objective at all? I mean, you said that you shouldn't have an outcome at the end, but of course there's an action plan that needs to come out the end. Should I have a question which is, I need to know how to manage X, Y, and Z better, or something like that?
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and yes, absolutely, because what it does, it gives, by having the employee or the coachee bring an objective or start with an objective or define an objective, it centers it for the employee. It gives the conversation a sense of purpose. And then you as the manager or coach can also see if where the conversation is going. Again, you're not leading the conversation, but you want to ensure that it's a purposeful discussion. Yes. Yes, okay. Absolutely. Okay, so I want to touch on very quickly, and this is China specific, the impact on coaching and generational differences.
Very interesting.
And we have a lot of conversations, and a lot of the conversations tend to be centered around Generation Y. And what I want to do at this segment is talk about the 3 distinct generations that exist in the workplace today.
Just in China? Or?
This is China. This is China-centric, because I know that's what the key interest is for the listeners. So let's start off the most discussed topic, but I want to touch on this because it helps frame it up anyways, the Generation Y. And we refer to this quite often in our webinars, but what I want to do is round it out with the different generations. So what is the research telling us? Okay, so that we know the Generation Y, they're part of the one-child policy, and they were born between 1977 to 1988. Currently, they represent about almost 20% of China's population, but a much higher representation of the working population.
Right. Okay.
So it's difficult to get those numbers, but it could be around 50% plus.
Right.
But then again, it also depends what sector you're in and what level within the organization. But just to give you a framework. So there's some very specific behaviors we're finding with this generation. This is based on the Steele case study, which was a white paper done in 2010. And they looked at the new gen workers in India and in China. So we know this, and this is consistent with everything that we've seen and we've already talked about. They want to be asked for their opinion. They are a very active participant in the workplace. The other thing that we're finding, this is the most technologically connected generation. That's probably consistent with what we're seeing in other parts of the world. Yeah. But you have to remember there was an absence of technology in the older generation. Yeah. Okay, so that's important. So there's an ease. I mean, it's probably, we had Victor Wong last week talking about online learning, and he was sharing with us some of the connectivity numbers in China, so the touch points and, you know, the touch points of people having access to technology and internet and mobile phones. But what we find with that is an ease of employees working, you know, globally. Yes. Very, very comfortable. You know, the previous generations really enjoyed the face-to-face, working, I can see you, you can see me, and we're working together. So they're very confident, they're not afraid to try new things, very optimistic, and we know that this is a generation, in the context of China, they're trendy, they're forward-thinking, because we know this is probably the first generation for a long, long time that has a much higher disposable income comparatively. So the question that often is asked, do they lack loyalty to organizations where they work? And we're going to challenge that, and the answer is no. Because, so then what is their motivation? And this is some roundtable research that I was involved in with Universal Ideas around a report that came out last year. What we're finding is what employees of this generation are saying, they want to grow and develop. So they want to be recognized for their contribution. So there's that, so what's going to happen is we'll see that there's a tendency to leave an organization if I'm not learning, I want to develop a reputation, I want to grow in the job, I want to be acknowledged, and, you know, I want to be exposed to new things. If that's not happening, if that's not being met, people will leave. So what I want to share now is coaching profiles of 10 years of data. So this is 10 years of coaching. Of average 8 to 12 months, and the tenure within the job within the organization for these employees was between 2 to 3 years, working both in global multinationals and SMEs. University educated, some with master's level, and I'm going to center for this next segment for mainland Chinese, who have worked and traveled abroad. Okay, so the question is, and this becomes very important as you begin to think about how do I manage and motivate employees. The Generation Y stressors are very, very high family expectations around achievement, around education. I'm just pausing here because it says the audio connection has been lost. Should I keep speaking? Okay, I'll keep speaking because it will pick up in a minute and we'll carry on. So what we're also finding is this generation, we'll see this in later generations, there's a desire for balanced lifestyle. If they're living in an urban city, they're stressed. There's tremendous financial pressures, the cost of living.
Yeah.
Some of the Chinese, Beijing, Shanghai are as expensive as any other city around the world. But this is also a generation, they want to be married, they want, and their family wants them to get married. They want them to have a family. They want a career. They want a house. They want everything. But what's interesting with this generation is this will be the first generation without sharing with a sibling the need to care for parents.
So going back to the balanced lifestyle, does that mean that the wages are higher in the big cities and they actually can afford to have more leisure time too? Do they spend their disposable income on extra time?
Yeah, you would think that's what it is. We know that salaries are higher in the larger tier 1 cities, but no, it's not high enough for people to live comfortably because the cost of living is very high. Okay. So they are feeling that pressure.
Right.
And it's interesting because we'd asked the question how many of them would be having a family member living with them, and 60% of them expect that.
Very nice.
They expect that will be a part of their life. Now let's look at the next generation. Now they're referred to as the lost generation because this generation was either born or grew up during the Cultural Revolution. Okay. And what that meant, the impact on them is many of them were pulled out of having an education. Many of them were prevented, did not have access or had the opportunity to continue their education. So, a very different lifestyle. But this generation is, in fact, actively very involved in the workplace in China today. So what we're finding is they're established in their career. They don't have, their desire of being on the fast track is changing. It's like, okay, I'm in, I've had a good career.
Yeah.
I'm ready to kind of, move away. Many of them are looking at a career change.
Right.
A lot of conversations around that. But what's interesting is this age group has, similar to the earlier age group, that they are very confident and clear about the management style they want to work with. And they also have a very preferred style they're looking for in terms of the managers they're leading with. Really defined. They're very clear on that. So their stressors, what's interesting here is where this is a sandwich effect. We see this in other parts of the world as well, but caring for both sets of the parents.
Yes.
Now this generation will typically have siblings, but you know what the difference is? Is usually one of the siblings is the higher income earner. And they have the financial responsibility to support a family. Now, one would think that, oh, does that mean my children or maybe my parents or my husband's or spouse's parents? But that could extend to cousins or uncles or nephews and so on. In many cases, where there are siblings, one of them has been the key income earner.
Okay.
So then we have nearing retirement. So those are the employees that are in their 50s, and they're starting to really contemplate retirement. There's, had a long career, feeling a bit burnt out, but they are looking to retirement. This is probably consistent to other parts of the world. We ask the question, now what am I going to do? How am I going to fill my days? But, the family, what's different is the family network is so important to this generation that generally they just get very involved in the family, caring for grandchildren and so on.
Yeah, and it's interesting to point out that the retirement age is quite low here in China. For women, it's something like 55.
That's right, and there are required, statutory requirements around retirement. Yeah, so for a lot of women, 55-year-old women may feel they're at the peak of their career and want to continue for another 10 years. So what's interesting with this group of leaders in the organization, they're feeling displaced. And the reason why is they recognize that they're quite disconnected with that very young generation that's coming through. Because you have to remember, they grew up with a very different management style that they worked for, which probably translated into them having a very different management style as well. So they recognize that the authoritative way is no longer effective. So this kind of frames up the three different generations. And what I want to move into, because I know this is what our listeners are most interested in, is so how do I begin to coach, and do I coach differently for this multi-generations? So I think a couple of things that I would suggest and recommend is that recognizing that a difference does exist in how these different distinct groups will learn and engage differently. And I'll talk about those differences in a minute. So what we're finding is their pace of learning or desire to learn new things, even how you would approach a coaching conversation would be quite different. Typically what we would find, many times what I find in the 50 plus, they still like to refer to you as a teacher or an expert, and they're looking for your advice, so that default mode does show up occasionally. Trust will be the underpinning for any coaching success, regardless of age. And this process does take time, so don't rush it, okay?
I'd just like to ask a question here about, this is a personal question before I get to Savas's question.
Yeah.
I worked with some employees who used to work in state-owned enterprises in China for quite a long time, and sometimes the style of working there, the management is quite different. It's very different. There's much more telling, autocratic, hierarchical. And so when this person ended up coming into our organization, they found it very difficult because we were much more, had a much more coaching style, asked questions on how they would do it, and they found that very difficult. So it took a long time and a lot of effort to coach them. What do you recommend in that situation?
You're absolutely right, because you have to remember, it's like if you worked with a manager around a different style that was more autocratic or telling, or, I think we touched on about the trust. It does take time. It takes a lot of time. And it's about the employee recognizing the safe space for learning or making mistakes, and it does take time. And I mean, I've even recognized that in different teams that I've worked with. And, you'd think that somebody who is very young, who would be, ready to take on responsibility, who, we often use the word in the West, be empowered by making decisions, but that's not always the case. So it does take a while to work with individuals that have come from a very traditional, regardless of age. The one thing you can probably acknowledge is that younger generation probably over time will be receptive and quite welcoming, to that different style of management. So let's look at Generation Y, and this ties in. I see you have a question that has come in, but let me just walk through Generation Y. So if you're coaching Generation Y, they have a comfort with learning and trying new things. They are going to be so open and so, relatively receptive, because remember, this is a generation that's highly motivated about learning. Some of them are quite well traveled. I am surprised meeting sort of young professionals like 20, 21, and they'll tell me they have traveled abroad. And also what we're finding is generally that this generation, they're going to be receptive to coaching and feedback because of the interest of learning. And also, we talked earlier, one of their key reasons for staying and motivating is for professional development. We talked earlier about their desire to be working with a manager that was more of a coaching style manager.
Should we come to Savas's question, actually? It does fit in quite nicely. Thank you for your question. And it's, if the Generation Y believes that he knows everything better than anybody in a very arrogant manner, I suspect the answer is, what do you do? Question is, what do you do?
Okay. So, I don't know if that was a question or a statement. But I think if it's a statement, I would say and I think a lot of people make that assumption about Generation Y, that they believe they know everything, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. But let's assume that this is in fact a question. So what if they feel they know everything, and perhaps are more arrogant about that? And I think that's going to take some time, because remember, we talked about one of the importance about coaching is the coachable moment is being receptive to coaching. So what happens in a case like that is if somebody feels that they know everything, they will eventually make mistakes, or they will find that their course of action may not be the best course of action. So if this person, you can interpret that individual as probably not being as open to a coachable moment, to a coaching moment, that will take more time. And I think, you know, for many of us, when we think about early in our career, we were quite confident in what we were doing and, you know, the decision we were making. And we had to make a few, you know, mistakes and errors on the job that made us kind of reflect and say, maybe I should just take a bit more time and listen to what my fellow colleagues or boss might be, you know, want to share with me. The coaching mid-career, so this is, you know, in the mid-30s moving into 40s. It's really about, it's important about acknowledging and recognizing their work. This is, you know, obviously a generation that has been working for many, many years and have worked during very difficult economic times. The economic times is just more in the last 10 years or so. We also be mindful also that this particular generation, they're impacted by increased pressures. There is a tremendous focus on education and ensuring that one's child is well educated or have the opportunity for education. The other thing they are faced with definitely at this age is aging parents and caring for them. I've known professionals that have stepped out of their career, you know, have taken long leave of absences to go and care for an aging parent because of the way the medical system is set up here. And in some cases, because this next generation can still be in their 30s and, you know, they have a desire to work, they're ready for a new career direction. And we're hearing this. We're having conversations. What we're hearing is, you know, being more entrepreneurial, maybe working for a smaller organization. So that ties in for the SMEs that are listening. What you'll find distinct difference, you had asked about this coaching styles. This group will tend to be very, very reflective, you know, really contemplative. And they love the value of the dialogue. To tie back to the question you said about different coaching style, what I find is the coaching style is really determined by the individual, but I'll see that many times, for example, in working with engineers, they tend to be very, very analytical, or, you know, IT project managers, very, very analytical. You'll see them many times, they're very receptive to coaching where they'll want to do mind maps and they'll do, you know, all sorts of decision-making analysis processes. So that sort of ties into the question that you had asked earlier about different coaching styles. So it's not so much about seniority. Many times you'll see it based on, you know, the area of where they're coming from. So lastly, there are fewer of them here than nearing retirement. And I think what's important is here's a group that are really stepping into retirement, probably to some degree looking forward to it, but a bit apprehensive. But you have to remember that in the organization, in the context of China, they're still very well regarded and well respected. Now, they are now working with 2 generations younger than them, maybe even more, because, you know, there's generation even before Generation Y, or later than Generation Y, that's now coming into the workplace. And so it's important to recognize and show their value. And by perhaps, you know, encouraging them to take on maybe a mentorship role or advisory role, you've got a wealth of knowledge. However, this particular generation, it's going to be a little more difficult for them to, you know, adapt and modify their management style because it is relatively traditional.
I just had a statement actually from Fiona before we go into question and answers, and maybe I'd be interested to see what you think. She said, in China, the dictatorial Generation X leaders are the greatest challenge. Given their dictatorial style, we find that staff are unable to problem solve but always have lots of opinions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think she's absolutely right. Thank you, Fiona. That's, I think, a good point and observation. And I think if you do have an organization or a company with a lot of leaders that are very, or more autocratic, I mean, that's going to impact your organization. In particular, if you're trying to foster an organization or an environment of learning, creativity, collaborative problem solving. Now, it's not to say that that individual style can't change or adapt, but what it does say, you'll have to surround that type of leadership with other different leadership styles. So we talked a couple of weeks ago, a little bit about recruiting, and that's really important, is think about what type of organization that you want to build, what sort of leadership style, and definitely recruit around that.
I hope that answers, gives you some insight, Fiona.
So I see it's 5 o'clock, at least in China, and we have completed the hour for our discussion today. And we did get a couple of notes that the audio was quite poor, but we will be posting a recording for this webinar. And, I'll pass it over to you, Jaspal, but I just want to thank everybody for their questions and tuning in today.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation on coaching. I really do hope that everybody got their questions answered. I'm really sorry again about the time and the audio. Please tune in next week. We also have another webinar on business development, and I hope you can join that as well. Please keep in touch with the website, and please join us again in the future.